Jonathan Portis, hello. How's it going?
Not too bad. I'm enjoying the show like everyone else.
Yes, aren't we all? It would be funny if it wasn't also so tragic. I mean, first of all, your reaction, Jonathan, to Jeremy Hunt's reversal of, well, nearly the entirety of Liz Truss's economic programme over the last few days.
It is obviously extraordinary. I mean, I think in some ways we are sort of back to where we were with Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. That is to say, we have austerity by stealth, as it were. We're going to see quite significant cuts to public services. We haven't heard yet what exactly the government is planning and what they think is politically feasible. And some increases in taxes at the same time. And I think while it is positive that the very large unfunded tax cuts have been ditched, which clearly were extremely damaging in all sorts of ways. I think there is a really real challenge for others to say, actually, austerity Mark II is not a great idea. If Liz Truss did have, I think, one fairly good point that she made repeatedly when she was running for the leadership, which was that the austerity round one was a failure and has contributed to giving us 12 years of relatively low growth, stagnation in productivity growth and so on, and a different approach is needed. The approach she set out was clearly the wrong one, and I think that is now universally accepted. But equally, austerity Mark II isn't necessarily going to give us anything better than austerity Mark I. So we do need to come up with some new ideas.
Could you explain just how radically different Jeremy Hunt's economic plan program is in comparison to that offered by Kwasi Kwarteng a couple of weeks ago, and also why he's had to come forward with something so different?
Well, it's different in the sense that Kwasi Kwarteng announced a very large program of unfunded tax cuts, which would have benefited primarily large businesses, not small businesses, but large businesses and the better off. Hunt has largely reversed that. Not entirely. There are still going to be, compared to what was otherwise planned, there are going to be some cuts in national insurance. Those will mostly benefit. They'll benefit most people to some extent, but most of the benefits will go to people earning more money, which I'm not sure is particularly well targeted at the moment. But most of those unfunded tax cuts have been reversed. He's also, Kwarteng didn't say what he was going to do about public spending, but Hunt has been very clear that he intends to cut public spending. He hasn't said yet how much or where those cuts will fall, but a necessary part of his strategy is cuts to public spending. So he's doing that. The reason he's had to do that is that simply that at a time when inflation is high and the Bank of England was already putting up interest rates, saying that the government was going to make very large unfunded tax cuts meant that markets thought the Bank of England would have to put up interest rates even higher to get inflation under control. And they therefore pushed up the interest rates on government borrowing and hence on mortgages. And all that was simply economically and politically unsustainable. So the whole Kwarteng Truss budget collapsed in on itself. The Truss-Hunt budget, I think, is much less likely to result in a substantial market panic. But that doesn't mean it's going to deliver what Truss says she wants and what we should all want, which is a return to sustained growth.
So it would appear that for political reasons, over the space of less than 2 months, Liz Truss has essentially had to reverse her entire political programme, and that has also not been without, I mean, really significant economic damage. Looking at gilt yields, mortgage interest rates, and potentially capital flight now. Investment leaving the UK. I mean, as far as an economic appraisal of the last sort of 2 months, I'm assuming it's not a great reading.
No, it's a terrible one. Obviously, I think the question of how much long-term economic damage there is remains open, right? Because none of the measures that she announced were actually implemented. So I think there's two kinds of economic damage. One, does it lead to related, but one, does it actually lead, as you say, to higher interest rates and so on? And that's not clear yet, right? Yes, interest rates spiked up a lot. And by more than they otherwise would have. They've now come down some in response to the Hunt U-turn. Are they, and remember, they were going up anyway for a variety of reasons, both global and UK. So are they going to end up being significantly higher than they would have if none of this had ever happened? I think it would be wrong if I claimed I knew the answer to that. I think it would be wrong if anybody claimed they knew the answer to that yet. We just don't know. It may be that people just shrug their shoulders and say, well, that was just a temporary moment of madness, and now we're back on the track that we were 3 months ago. I think Truss has done considerable damage to UK's economic institutions. She sacked the permanent Secretary of the Treasury and said very explicitly it was because she didn't really want to hear what he had to say, or what other Treasury civil servants advised her. She refused to allow the Office of Budget Responsibility to make a forecast of what the budget would mean, and then she or the Chancellor lied about that quite blatantly. And she hasn't exactly handled relationships with the Bank of England very well. So there's a sense in which you trash the credibility of the economic institutions of the country. It has to be said, though, there, of course, that she's not doing this in a vacuum. We've had several years of this. We've had a prime minister who blatantly lied in a way which his predecessors wouldn't have. So I think there is definitely a sense in which the last few conservative prime ministers have trashed have disrespected or disempowered the institutions of the country, the constitution of the country, in a number of ways. Attacks on lawyers, the Supreme Court, attempted prorogation of Parliament, lying to Parliament, all of those things. Truss has sort of turned that fire on the economic institutions, but she's not exactly doing this in a vacuum. And that, I think, does have a sort of some very difficult to quantify, but does have negative long-term impacts on the perception of the UK. Not, it's not, again, we shouldn't exaggerate. These are not irreparable. There's still lots of things going for this country, but they're certainly not helpful.
So let's pursue that line of questioning then, because earlier you said that austerity Mark II was not going to be to the benefit of the country economically. So I mean, is there an alternative course of action that's viable, or is it kind of a case of this is the tough medicine that needs to be ingested now, and it's just going to be stomached?
I mean, I don't think there certainly isn't an easy course of action, and there's no course of action that doesn't involve a certain amount of pain. But you can decide, but there are different strategies, and you can decide how that pain is distributed. My view was, in austerity Mark I, was that we could have borrowed considerably more, we could have invested, and we would have not been such, and we would have had higher growth and less damaged public services when we went into the pandemic. So we'd have come out of it more strongly. That, of course, is water under the bridge. There are no easy choices facing us, but we do have different choices. My view is that if we want to restore our public services, which have been degraded and hollowed out for the last 10 years, if we want to deal with the very real poverty and destitution in this country, we can, but it will involve somewhat higher taxes, and it will involve reforming and restructuring the tax system in a way which no government in recent years has been prepared to do. That means probably higher taxes on wealth and property, which no government is prepared to do. It means reforming council tax, reforming the treatment of pensions, and so on. These are not easy things to do, but they are different choices, and choices which I think would make us more prosperous in the long run.
A word on Brexit, Jonathan, because it seems to be the sort of the elephant in the room in all of this. A lot of talk over the last few weeks about growth and the need for economic growth. When my understanding was the last time the OBR looked at the economic impact of Brexit, they forecast a 4% reduction in GDP, or attributed a 4% reduction in GDP over the long term to it. How does that stack up for you? Is that sort of an economic elephant in the room as such, that perhaps if that was a question that was looked at differently or analysed, then perhaps we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now?
Well, I don't think you can put all the UK's economic problems down to Brexit. First of all, a lot of what's going on right at the moment is, of course, global, and no European country is immune. Perhaps Norway is, because they have a lot of gas, but other European countries are in not dissimilar situations from us. Brexit is, as you said, very much a long-term factor, and is a long-term factor restricting the growth in the economy. I think at the very minimum, we need to reboot and reset our economic relationship with the EU, since we had a government which seemed to be determined to have confrontation with the EU in a number of respects, and all that has generally soured the relationship, and that clearly is doing some economic damage. So you could make some progress simply by saying, well, okay, we have an agreement with the EU, we're going to make it work, we're going to make the Northern Ireland Protocol work, we're going to try and restore, repair our political and diplomatic relationship, and hence try and rebuild the trading relationship. Where that ends up, whether that ends up with just a better version of the deal we have now, with some form of return to the single market, or eventually rejoining, these are very much political questions, and go much wider than economics. I think it's undoubtedly true that we would be better off economically as a member of the European Union. I don't think there's any serious doubt about that. But that does very much depend on politics. It will require a big political shift here, as well as some political movement on the other side of the channel as well. And there are plenty of things that we can do without rejoining as well that would make things better. But I would also say that none of this is a panacea in itself, as Brexit is part of the reason why we're in the mess we're in, but it's not the only reason by any means. And there isn't some sort of magic wand that suddenly gets us out of all of this just by rejoining the EU. That's just not the way it works.
Yes, and perhaps it may not just be a coincidence that some of Liz Truss's favourite economists were some of the only ones who are prepared to advocate for that departure from the EU. But that's a conversation for another day. Jonathan, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. I know you're a busy man.
Cheers.
Thank you.